Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of professional advisors working lunches. Today, we're pleased to welcome back our good friends at Schroders. I'm Jenna Brown, Deputy Editor of Professional Advisor, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Before we get going with today's session, let me quickly run through the usual housekeeping. Your microphones and cameras are currently switched off, and we'd be most grateful if you could keep them that way. It will ensure there's no background noise so the speakers can be heard more clearly. I should also inform you that the session is being recorded and we will send you a link of the recording by tomorrow. Do feel free to share this with your colleagues. And as usual, today's working lunch will qualify for 1 hour of CPD and we'll be sending your proof of attendance along with the link to the recording of the session, which will arrive in your inboxes tomorrow. Also, please could you ensure your full name is visible on the Zoom screen? Thank you. As the business of running an advisor business on a day-to-day basis becomes ever more demanding, outsourcing, particularly in and around the investment proposition, is very much on the rise. Using data from their annual advisor survey, I'm delighted to be joined today by two key executives from Schroders, Intermediary Solutions Director Gillian Hepburn and CIO Schroders Investment Solutions Alex Funk, who will reveal what advisors typically look for in a provider and how important are factors such as performance, cost, process, and service. Of course, it goes without saying that they will also discuss where consumer duty fits into all of this. Do feel free to put any and all of your questions to our guests using the chat function. You will find this at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to remain anonymous, then simply select my name from the drop-down list in the chat box before you type your message, so only I can see it. So, just before I hand over to Gillian, let me quickly run you through our learning objectives for today's session. At the end of today's presentation, you should be able to identify the increase in outsourcing trends and why it is important to advisor firms, understand the criteria advisors use when selecting a solutions provider, understand the relationship between using a solutions provider and consumer duty. So that's the CII and CPD covered. Let's hear from Gillian Hepburn from Schroders. Good afternoon, Gillian.
Good afternoon, Jenna, and welcome to everybody on the call over lunchtime today. We're really delighted to be taking part as ever. We're going to cover a number of different themes in the next half an hour or so, but obviously we'd be really delighted to get any questions coming through from you, and I think Jenna's going to pick those up and we'll answer them at the end of this session. Fingers crossed. As Jenna mentioned, we are going to use our advisor survey, just not all of it, but just some of the key areas with regards to outsourcing. And by the way, I hate that word. I think I've said that for years in the industry, but I can't come up with a suitable alternative. So we're going to stick with it for the next 45 minutes, 1 hour. But what we're going to look at is, first of all, what is the current landscape around outsourcing? Is it increasing? And what are some of the future predictions from the advisors that we spoke to as part of the survey? If it is increasing, so there's a bit of a giveaway, what's driving that increase? And then also, what do advisors look for when they're selecting a provider? So what are some of the selection criteria? And then we're going to end, I was going to say sadly, because every presentation at the moment seems to have consumer duty somewhere in it, but we're going to share some of our thoughts as a solutions provider in terms of where this might fit into consumer duty for you, either as part of your process and thinking about fair value, but also talk a little bit about what we are having to do as a manufacturer of investment solutions in order to help comply with the consumer duty regulation. So hopefully that'll be a slightly different slant on things as well. As Jenna said, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Alex Funk, Chief Investment Officer here for Schroders Investment Solutions. And we'll also pick up a little bit on the market and what's been happening recently with regards to outsourcing. So I'm just going to start with a couple of slides in terms of what the advisor survey actually told us. So the first area that we always look at is, how has your use of outsourced solutions or outsourced portfolio management, as we called it, it changed in the last year. Now, this survey was done back in November of last year, so it's still very recent. I suppose the key thing that we picked up from this was in the last year, 20% of advisors had told us that they had increased their level of outsourced portfolio management. So I guess for us as a provider of that was great news. So it feels still that there is a continual move to outsourcing of the investment proposition. But actually what's probably more interesting is, well, what does that start to look like in practice? And actually what percentage, because we're very aware that advisors will run a centralized investment proposition, that perhaps not everything is outsourced. They'll have a range of providers for different client groups, for different client segments. So it's always important to think, well, what percentage is actually outsourced? And I think for me, the interesting statistic is the one on the left-hand side of this graph, where the number of advisors that are now almost like outsourcing or outsourcing none of their investment proposition has reduced to only 22%. And actually what you'll see is back in November, so the previous year, that was 33%. So we've seen a 10% reduction in the number of advisors who are telling us that they now outsource everything, essentially. And actually, just as a point of interest in terms of the advisor survey, we actually had over 400 responses to the survey this year. That was the highest level of engagement that we've had from advisors. There will be one following very shortly. So if any of you do get the chance to respond to us, we're really keen to hear your views because it helps to shape our thinking in terms of our investment solutions business, but actually how are advisors thinking, behaving, what can we do better as a solutions provider? But that was an interesting one for us in terms of the actual level of outsourcing. So it's one thing doing it, but what proportion of the assets are actually being outsourced in practice? And then obviously we start to look at, well, if that's what we're doing at the moment, what does the future look like? So let's get the crystal ball out and think about how advisors expect their level or their use of outsourcing in the next year to increase and across what areas. So what we saw here was that 23% of advisors said that they were going to increase their use of multi-asset funds, and 21% said they would increase their use of third-party model portfolios. So clearly as a provider that offers both of those, that was good news. In terms of discretionary fund management, so that's a pure bespoke portfolio for a client, that's still relatively high, 19%, saying we're going to increase our allocation to that. But today, although we obviously offer full discretionary management through Cazenove, we are going to focus on model portfolios and multi-asset funds. Alex, I don't know if we've got any comments so far around some of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting, and it'd be good to see if anyone has comments on the call as well, whether you're actually increasing your use of sort of third-party model portfolio services, and what the shape of that looks like as well, because we're seeing sort of more and more different models coming out. And when I mean different models, I don't mean from an investment proposition, but from how MPS providers work with advisors, from a marketing material perspective, from a structuring on different platforms, and so hopefully we'll get some time to discuss those different models and some of the views that you have as well. So let's keep it interactive, and if you come across anything interesting, we can unpack that as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we often get asked, don't we, what is better, a multi-asset fund or a model portfolio? And my answer is, well, they're different. They essentially they are both multi-asset vehicles, but there are times where from a client outcome perspective, a model portfolio is better or a multi-asset fund is better.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think where we've seen some keen differences between them is, so first of all, a model portfolio excuse me, is a collection of funds wrapped up for a client, right? And therefore the client actually buys units in each of those underlying funds that you suggest in the model portfolio. In a fund or a multi-asset fund, the client buys one unit price and one net asset value ultimately. So where this became really important was through managing income for investors. Income model portfolios are challenging in the way that each of the underlying funds that clients buy units in them will have a different ex-dividend date that an advisor or a client needs to monitor. And therefore income distributions can be lumpy, can be missed because of taking fees, rebalancing, adding money in. And so a multi-asset fund is a much more efficient vehicle to manage income, because the fund manager or the model manager can actually control the buying and the selling of the underlying funds, striking the right ex-dividend dates, considering when to add and remove funds as well. And then the clients only need to focus on the ex-dividend of the overall fund. And so you can see how that simplifies life a lot. And then the last bit is, in a fund structure, you have the ability to sort of smooth some of the income, because as you receive the dividends and the coupon payments, you don't have to pay it away straight away. And you can then create a much more smooth trajectory of income payments for clients. And I think, that's just one example of how models and funds work well together, i.e. where, MPS really good for growth clients, funds are good for growth clients as well, but income is just better in a fund than it is in an NPS.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, because up until, I can't remember the exact date last year, we actually offered both. So we offered a model portfolio for income and we offered a fund. And we actually took quite a bold step, didn't we? Because we closed the model portfolio and moved clients to a fund, spent a lot of time engaging with advisors, explaining exactly what you just covered and why we felt it was a better client outcome to try and manage income within the fund structure. And I think, to be fair, we had no adverse feedback from doing that, because effectively the model was shaped exactly like the fund anyway. So there wasn't any significant difference for clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we continue to see more investors coming into the fund now, because it's easier to understand. The income is more seamless and it is more smooth.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously we all know the arguments, I guess, of managing CGT, and how if it's in an unwrapped, in a general investment account, then that can be more challenging, because we operate as agent as clients, so we don't know who the clients are, so we can't actually manage CGT.
But even in that instance, no model portfolio provider can really manage CGT, even if they did have sight of the end client, because each client will be rebalanced at that point in time, whether they have a gain or not.
Absolutely.
And so I think, if we think about our client base, 70% of our model portfolios are in ISAs or SIPs.
Yeah, exactly.
With a very small proportion in GIA. When our fund of funds business, or our multi-asset funds, it's probably the other way around.
Sure. Yeah. So what we're seeing is advisors really, putting clients, I guess, in the right solution depending on the tax wrapper that's available. There's another, and we'll come on to cost again later on, but there's a little bit about a myth. I always think that model portfolios are more expensive than multi-asset funds. Do we have a view on that one?
It depends what you're looking for, right? So I think if we think about the low-cost multi-asset feta type solutions, clearly they can be very cost competitive, right? Because a lot of the building blocks are within the business.
Yeah.
When it comes to the historical, very successful fund of funds that were managed in the UK marketplace, they were managed less on an outcome basis, more on an absolute return basis. They were quite contrarian in some cases. The fees were quite high because you were paying a management fee there rather than a model fee. And I think where the market is moving now is to discriminate less between multi-asset funds that are managed like model portfolios and model portfolios. And we've certainly done that, obviously, within our ranges to align the management fee across the board. But I think there'll be more and more pressure on consumer duty, which we'll no doubt get into, will be a driver of this as well.
Yeah. And what about the actual holdings then within a fund? Do you think that gives you slightly more flexibility?
Absolutely. And you can negotiate different fees.
Yeah.
If I'm buying, a fund from a third-party fund manager, I have the ability to negotiate a much better price in our fund than I can on 14 different platforms in the UK marketplace, because operationally it's quite difficult for them to manage that.
Yeah. Okay. So a number of different, I guess, just differences, but what we're not seeing is one is better than the other. They're just different, and it's about the client outcome that you're trying to achieve.
I think as a CIP, you need both.
Yeah.
I don't think you can have a holistic CIP without both.
Yeah. So with all of that in mind, we then ask, what are the drivers behind the decisions to outsource? And actually, as you'll see from this slide, and we ask this year on year, we've just given here the last 3 years worth of responses. And it doesn't really change very much, does it, Alex? First of all, access to investment expertise like yourself and your team, and the resources that come with that. I'm kind of keen to talk about the second one, which is effective volatility management, because certainly the advisors that I've spoken to over the last probably 2 years now, we've probably had, I think probably three times, three experiences of volatility. Obviously, we had the COVID challenges, we had the beginning of last year, the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and then more recently, we've had the situation that was triggered by the SVB situation. And we found we spent a lot of time talking with advisors that work with us, certainly, about obviously the last one, but right across the piece. What's your views here about what's happening in markets at the moment, and what's causing some of that volatility?
Yeah, I think 2023 will not be a year with less volatility, unfortunately. And clearly we've had, if we roll back sort of our investment framework, you've got 2020 lockdown, lots of fiscal stimulus, lots of monetary stimulus, bit of an experiment. Governments don't really know the outcome of COVID. 2021 into 2022 is this big reopening play. We are let out of our home. The Amazon boxes don't pile up anymore. We actually go to the pub, we go back to the park, we eventually go on holiday. And that proved to be extremely inflationary. There was a lot of discussion around transitory versus not transitory inflation. It was clear now, in hindsight, very well, that was very inflationary. Yeah. What didn't help was the energy crisis, which then followed. But where we've landed today is you cannot have 400 basis points in rate hikes across developed markets without something happening. And I think everyone was so focused on rates and inflation that there were parts of the economic system that have been affected. And the banking sector is a place where some of that cracks has now been shown. Clearly, our view is that this is not a 2008 style crisis. This is very much focused on that sort of mid-tier regional banks specific to the US and the capitalization structure of them. Nonetheless, it's volatility. And banking is the business of trust. And the minute you lose that trust, whether you're a good bank or not a good bank, you will have a sell on your share price. And what I think this is highlighted to the Fed, to the market, is that there are negative consequences from a 9-fold increase in interest rates, right? Which we always said would come and would drive slowdown. And this is just evidence of that. So I think that's driving the market volatility. But the outcome of that means that there will be tighter credit lending, which in effect acts as a rate hike as well. So our sort of view of a slowdown is now much greater. We always knew it was coming, but this sort of enhanced our sort of view to say that slowdown is now coming. Tighter credit lending, higher interest rates, central banks are not going to cut. Will we see more cracks? Potentially, but I think this is a clear evidence that there is pressure in the system, and that will work through into our next phase of the economic cycle.
Okay, and do you want to have a word on inflation and what are our views there?
Yeah, so I think inflation is probably peaked in most markets. I think what we saw in the UK recently was a little bit idiosyncratic due to what we will now dub the Aldi crisis, with the lack of tomatoes driving up some of that food price. But ultimately, it is evidential that inflation is peaked. Service inflation is quite sticky, so that is creating a really painful headache for central banks across the world. It doesn't want to roll over. The cost of rent through something we call owner's equivalent rent, that's not rolling over. The labor market is really tight. Wage prices are still high. Yes, they probably have peaked as well, but they're still high, and therefore you have bargaining power and you continue to spend. And so this is creating an issue. And so inflation is in a downward trajectory. It's going to take a little longer to get there. But by sort of Q4, we would have much lower levels of inflation, but they'll be much higher than the past decade. Yeah. So when I say much higher, I don't mean 5%. I think you're in and around 3%, 2%, and you're hearing more headlines about keeping inflation lower in the next decade than creating inflation. I think we're in this sort of regime shift that we're currently understanding.
Okay. So one of the things that we obviously do in terms of this access to investment expertise and resources and volatility management, obviously Alex and the team work really hard in terms of managing all of the volatility, thinking about the investment solutions, but also spending time running webinars for the clients that work with us and use our investment solutions, not just on a quarterly basis, which are regular updates, particularly when we review asset allocation and we talk about what's been happening, but also I think it's important to be on the front foot all the time and have regular kind of ad hoc webinars for clients when market conditions might be a bit challenging, or when we think there's something that's really important that we want to talk about, because it relates to this next point in terms of advisors always tell us that one of the reasons they outsource is about spending more time with the clients, but our view is the advisor is absolutely in the driving seat with the client, but how can we help deliver and support good quality client conversations? And I think some of the work that we do and that solutions providers should be doing is this kind of ongoing dialogue and communication.
It's sound bites, right? So as you're meeting with your clients, you want to have the right frame of the right setting at that point in time. You don't want to wait for that information.
Sure.
And I think you need to make sure that's accessible.
Yeah. So for us, I guess what we see here in terms of the reasons why advisors decide to outsource is always important. Whilst they don't vary much year on year, it's always important for us to keep checking on those and to check that we're really aligned to that in terms of how we operate and how we work. What was though interesting for me was back in November, this focus on the regulatory burden seemed one of the lower factors. It will be interesting to see when we do our next survey whether that's increased, particularly around things like consumer duty, which we'll come on to in a minute or two. But I find it interesting that that's generally lower down. And also this effective integration of sustainability, although I think maybe that's relating to the top point there in terms of investment expertise and resources. Because Alex, you work, although you're CIO for our solutions business, you work right across the Schroders group, don't you, in terms of integration of sustainability when we're running our sustainable models?
Yeah, I think so. It's all about getting a good diverse view from an investment aspect, whether that be research, economics, macro, multi-asset and sustainability, and we can access all of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're more than happy, or Alex is more than happy, to take any questions at the end of this session, particularly in relation to some of the volatility in markets and what we think is happening with the banking situation. So moving on, and again, this doesn't change hugely year on year, but we always ask, what are the most important factors once you've decided to outsource for the reasons that we've shown in the previous slide? What are actually the most important factors that you, the advisors that are on the call here, consider when you're selecting the appropriate provider? And really, this doesn't change much. And we look at both model portfolios and multi-asset funds, and the top two are always performance and cost. And that's probably, no big surprise. And again, we'll talk about that in relation to some of the work that we're doing here to support consumer duty. So performance and cost, very important. But actually what often comes in as number 3 is the investment process. Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about how we approach this whole piece around investment process and what's important to us within our solutions business in terms of how can we support advisors in terms of understanding that process?
Yeah, so when it comes to outcomes, which is ultimately what you want for your investors, you do your financial plan, you determine, statements required, the different life goals that they might have, and you want to achieve those investment goals and outcomes. And the best way to achieve that is through a consistent investment process. A process is something that doesn't change, doesn't matter how the investment cycle does. It always gets improved and enhanced as we learn more information, but the core gist of that process stays the same. And I think that is at the heart of our philosophy, right? We have a very structured, very disciplined investment process that's been proven over long periods of time. And it starts really with thinking about long-term asset allocation. If you think about really long-term outcomes, 90% of return variation is driven by asset allocation. So making sure you have that right as a starting point is absolutely crucial. You then optimize that strategic asset allocation to make sure that for a given level of risk, you have the right mix of asset classes. Your fund research is really important. So having an independent committee structure, so one person doing the research, another person actually signing off the research, creates good debate and really sort of solidifies that. And then what are you doing sort of on a monthly, quarterly and annual basis to continue to reassess that and then start over again? And that's a very sort of high level view on some of our process principles. But I think, if you had to sort of summarize, it's multi-asset, make sure you're in the right asset classes, not putting all the eggs in one basket. It's multi-managed, no one's right all the time. And I think that's crucially important. It's multi-styled. So we're quite happy to, own active and passive. We're quite happy to not just be value, We understand that timing some of those idiosyncratic risks are very difficult. So having good exposure between value, growth, quality, momentum, and size in the portfolio is absolutely crucial in these volatile times.
Yeah, and in fact, multi-styles is quite important, and advisors that we work with often say that when they're looking for a provider, they look for somebody that has a range, not just of risk profiles, but also different styles for different clients. So, active, what we call strategic index, predominantly passive, and then sustainable. And then obviously, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of funds, we have a low cost range, and then we have a blended active passive range. And we're always looking at what else can we do differently, what are clients looking for from us. In terms of the low cost range that we're currently calling the tactical funds, kind of what I'd like to say is just watch the space. We're doing a bit of work with those funds and doing a bit of reshaping, and there'll be some interesting news coming shortly. But the blended funds I think are quite interesting in terms of that active passive, because what we found when we worked with advisors, they were quite often selecting active funds and putting portfolios together and then putting in some passive to bring the price down. And one of the things we looked at was what was that process doing for the end client outcome, and could we do that in a more, dare I say, kind of scientific way. So we actually look at active passive at each asset class, don't we, Alex, in terms of how we approach this?
I think the history of active and passive has very much been sort of Batman versus Superman in a little way. And so the philosophy that we think about is that the principles around investing in active and passive is that there is no such thing as passive investing. And by buying a passive, you're making an active decision. And how do you then counter for that in your portfolio? So if you're buying the S&P 500, you must have a view that large tech companies will do well over long periods of time, because that is the composition of that index. If you're buying passive global government bonds, you must take market neutral duration, etc. Right? So by combining active and passive without thinking, and not just buying passive in order to reduce cost, I think you result in better outcomes, because there is an investment thesis for owning those instruments alongside one another. Again, we can pick up some more of that a little bit later.
Yeah, perhaps to take questions on how we work that and the kind of active passive split, as I always call it, and where we are in the cycle.
Yeah,
so we can be happy to take any questions on that kind of combination of active passive, because I think, to your point, it's not binary any longer, isn't it? It's
exactly.
I think there's opportunities for active and passive to sit alongside each other.
Yeah.
And just before I move on, one of the areas that's not actually something that we ask about in terms of factors, but we're definitely seeing a rise at the moment in terms of white labeling of model portfolios. So, and for any of you who are aware of our solution, we launched just coming up for 2 years, although the solutions have a longer track record, but the actual Schroders Investment Solutions brand is now coming up for a 2-year anniversary. And we've been asked a lot about white labeling, and my view was always, we're happy to do it when it's the right thing commercially for all parties, but also I'm always really hot on service, and if we cannot white label a model portfolio solution and give the advisor and the client what they want in terms of quarterly reporting, updated fact sheets in line with how we run our, if I could call it, our standard offering, then that's not a good place to be. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how we industrialize that process to make sure that anybody who does work with us on a white labeled solution gets the same level of service as somebody that uses our standard models. So I guess I could say we were maybe a bit slower to market in terms of what we're doing in white labeling, but it was important that we could actually support that effectively. And so, we're always happy to talk to people about what white labeling means to us. But another area that we're seeing quite interesting is in terms of this whole bespoking of portfolios and working with advisors on investment committees. I suppose we have quite interesting views on that might differ, don't we, Alex, in terms of, we're either outsourcing or you're not, and where advisors work with us on investment committees and where we kind of draw lines because of the regulatory responsibility.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say something about that.
I think maybe we'll start from the white label and then we'll sort of move into that. I think I speak to a lot of advisors about investment propositions and requirements, and if you think about white labeling, there's sort of two broad cohorts. One that the investment process is important to an advisor business, and clients really value that, and they want that brand continuity, right, from advice into investment. And that's where white label, i.e., Schroders' best ideas, but submitted to a co-brand white label portfolio, is interesting. Then there's the advisor that says, I absolutely want to be separate from the investment component. So I want to go and do an all of market due diligence and choose my CIP. I want evidence to clients that the value that I bring is being able to not kick on those tires, make sure which is the best solutions provider, and create that partnership. If Schroders doesn't deliver, I've kept my due diligence separate from that, and I'm able to change providers more consistently. So we see lots of that. I think there's lots of white label just for the fact of white label. And I think my concern there is operationally, I know how many people we have and how much money we invest in this. It's not an easy task. So whoever you partner with, make sure not just the investment is due diligence is completed, but also the operational due diligence. How many people, how many platforms, how is it rebalanced at the same time, or the share classes any different, etc., etc. So I think there's a lots of operational questions to be asked. So that's why I'm a little bit more conservative on that. Then on the bespoke models, I think it's very clear in the eyes of the regulator that the discretionary manager is responsible, and whoever you partner with, you must ensure that that stays that way, and that you potentially do not have a majority say in some of the portfolios, because the regulator will look to the discretionary manager. And I think, something we'll get onto probably is around, co-manufacturing and so on. And what does that mean for your, fair value assessments, your consumer duty statements, and so on and so forth. So yes, on paper, a lot of these things look really exciting, innovative, but be very careful in how you structure those relationships to make sure from a regulatory, legal, and actually client experience outcome that's structured properly.
Yeah. So, but we're obviously always happy to have conversations about that and understand some requirements and see if we can meet them. I'm just going to finish on consumer duty. I've got a slide here, and I'm sure you've all seen loads of these kind of slides that talk about or just refer to, as a reminder, what is consumer duty. So you'd be glad to know today I'm not going to talk about what is consumer duty. I'm going to absolutely assume that you've all been beaten up to death about what are the 4 different outcomes. Although I believe that Professional Advisor ran some great workshops recently with Bank Hall to talk about consumer duty. I'm sure they're available on download as well if you get in touch with PA. But for us as a solutions provider, interestingly, model portfolios up until now, as Alex explained, they're not really or have never been regulated entities. They exist purely by the benefit of platform technology. And as a result of consumer duty, we're now, I was going to say caught by the regulation, but that's not the right term, but we're now actually under consumer duty, have to comply with some of the regulation in a number of these different areas. And I just thought it would be helpful just to talk a little bit about our thinking and what we'll have to deliver, what we will be delivering at the end of April certainly for our clients around consumer duty and how we thought about the different consumer outcomes and where that resonates. So on this slide, all I've done very simply is taken the 4 consumer outcomes and thought about each of those in the context of outsourced solutions. So things like products and services. So how do we help advisors to ensure that they're delivering the right products and services to their clients? And for us, it's about providing a target market document. So for all of the model portfolios and the funds, are we helping our advisors make sure that these are being distributed to the right target market? Now, interestingly, we have had a target market document for quite some time now, but clearly for consumer duty, we're doing a bit of work just to refresh that and to really challenge ourselves. Is this still fit for purpose? Do we need to update it? Do we need to refine it? And one of the things that I've been on a few consumer duty webinars recently, one of the things I've talked about is let's make sure that this isn't just a tick box exercise. Let's make sure that what we do to support consumer duty genuinely makes a difference and that we're really challenging ourselves within the business. So in terms of products and services, obviously we have a target market document. Many providers will also offer you standard RFP documents. So any of those are available from us and any of your other providers. And obviously, if somebody has bespoke requirements in terms of identifying what your solutions provider delivers, we obviously produce bespoke documentation or answer additional questions on top of the standard RFP. But also it's interesting because the regulator a number of years ago talked about doing due diligence on your provider and talked about how you shouldn't always rely on the provider's documentation because often that's marketing. And as a result of that, I think it's also important therefore to think about where you can get other help and support in terms of doing or undertaking due diligence on your solutions provider, your model portfolio provider. So for us, for example, we appear on the LineCat Analyzer, which many of you might use for platforms, but they also have a module now for model portfolios. We're also on DD Hub, which I think is a really interesting tool because it enables you to produce an RFP that's bespoke to your business, or there's standard templates that are provided that you can download and compare different solutions providers. FE Transmission, of course, many of you use that and for performance, and we have licenses that we work with advisors on. And then Morningstar have a tool also that delivers some performance. So for us, it's about making sure that we can help you ensure that you're delivering the right products and services to the target market, both from data from ourselves, but where do we appear on third-party solutions that just give you that independence. Price and value is the really interesting one, isn't it, right across the industry. And for us, we're obviously having to provide fair value assessments. Now, within Schroders, obviously, we've provided assessment of value for our fund business for a number of years now. And I think what was interesting there was we weren't all very sure about what to do the first time round. And I think as we all got better at doing this as an industry, we got to a more standardized template. And I think personally that we'll end up like that within the model portfolio market. So Alex and I have spent many hours over the last few weeks and months thinking about the fair value assessments for the model portfolios and how we're going to produce those and what they're going to look like. Alex, I don't know, it's maybe a good point to say what are the areas that we've considered when we're putting together the fair value assessment documents.
Yeah, it's a good one. And, clearly your starting point would be an assessment of value, but there are multiple aspects that are just not relevant to model portfolios. And so the first point is starts really about performance, right? Are you generating what the model portfolio objective is set out to achieve over that right investment period? And that might be a combination of, performance against peers, performance relative to a risk mapping service potentially, or a combination of those two aspects. The next part is then to say, well, given that you deliver performance, do you do that at a price point that makes sense? So first of all, make sure you're doing your performance analysis net of fees, because model portfolios are not unitized, right? So someone could produce numbers gross of fees ultimately. So really important takeaway. So net of fees, are you adding value relative to that? Then from a charges perspective, so what we did is we analyzed, now that there is more data available through databases such as Morningstar, we can analyze the cost of all model portfolios with similar objectives and then determine in which quartile do we sort of fall from a pricing perspective, 1 on an MPS fee and 2 on an OCF and 3 on a combined aspect, right? And so I think that's quite important as well. And then around quality of service, so how quickly do you get your fact sheets? How consistent do they arrive? What sort of information does the model manager provide? Is it video format? Is it not? And we can put some KPIs around that into how quickly we can deliver it. And then the last bit around this is, how sustainable, and I use this in a different way. It's not sustainable as an ESG, but how sustainable as in longevity does that business have, right? So does it have the ability to continue to invest back into its service? Is this a primary core service that's offered by the business? And therefore, can you be confident that you and your clients can partner for many, many years to come, and that business will continue to invest and innovate as the market does as well? And those sort of 4 key aspects, I think, on a sort of red, amber, green, will give you a feel for whether you're getting fair value from that offering.
Yeah, so I think our messages, we've done lots of work. It will be available at the end of April. But also a message, we spent a lot of time working with advisors who run their own advisory models. And clearly the same will apply to anybody running advisory models in terms of producing essentially target market document and fair value assessments. And that's been an interesting journey, I think, for many advisors who hadn't actually grasp the fact that they will now need to produce these. They might not need to make them available unless asked, but they will actually need to work through the fair value assessments. And I know for us that's been, I was going to say, a bit of a headache at times. It's been a bit of a challenge just to think about how we do that. Clearly, we had the benefit of working with the fund business and looking at how that had been done through the fund business. But obviously, the criteria that we use for models are very different. So I think it's going to be a case of watch this space post-April as everybody starts to distribute the fair value assessments and to look at how we will improve over time. I think that's kind of my message. But also, if you are running advisory models, it's definitely something to think about, because under the consumer duty regulation, they will need to be produced similarly with target market document. But we believe that if we deliver price and value, that those advisors then that are outsourcing can then spend more time delivering their value to clients, because obviously as an advisor, you have the fair value assessment in terms of your overall advice process, and the investment component is just one piece of it. So I spent some time on a call with advisors recently asking them what they expected us as their solutions provider to deliver. And it was a case of, if you give us your fair value assessments, then we will integrate that into the documentation that we are providing for the regulator for our own overall fair value assessments. So certainly interesting times ahead for all of us, and I do think things will settle down over the next year or so as we all get better at doing this. But certainly as a first pass, it's been a really interesting exercise for us. In terms of consumer understanding, obviously we in our business deliver a whole range of documentation, webinars, videos to really help with consumer understanding. And you know, every solutions provider, I'm sure, does similar things to us. But what was important under consumer duty is that we sit back and look at all of that and really question ourselves as to whether or not the consumer understands what we're delivering. So whilst we don't deliver anything directly to the client, obviously, a lot of the documentation and the videos that we deliver are retail complied. So that means that an advisor, so can take, Alex has a great quarterly video actually in terms of our updates. And we retail complied that recently for advisors to pass directly to their clients. And it was really interesting because the feedback was always, yeah, the clients really like that 3-minute video. But my challenge was, well, liking it and understanding what Alex says are two completely different things. So for us, what we've done is we've prioritized all of the documentation that we issue out, and we're going through a process externally, consumer testing all of that. So it's going to be really interesting to see to what extent do consumers really understand what we are delivering, and therefore how do we change that? Yeah.
Absolutely crucial.
So you might get barred from saying things like investment sleeves, for example, Alex, which I know is a phrase that he loves, but I just think sleeves are in coats. So there you go. So it'll be really interesting to get feedback on the documentation and just to try and make some of those changes. So for us, there's a big list, and we've prioritized it. We will have definitely a lot of that reviewed before we have to go live, but it will be work in progress as well. I've actually left the last column purposely blank because actually I thought when I was putting this slide together, I thought, well, what do we do in terms of consumer support? Well, actually, we don't interface directly with the consumer. That's the role of the advisor. So for me, it's about, if we get everything right in these first 3 columns, then that enables advisors to deliver great consumer support and ongoing conversations and help in terms of understanding their investment proposition, ensuring that they're in the right proposition to meet their outcomes. And so for me, that was a case of, and maybe I was just, somebody actually asked me, had I forgotten to complete the last column or had I got bored? No, it was on purpose. But for us, this is where we just take feedback from advisors all the time. So along the bottom, in addition to the consumer market testing, we also run a regular advisor forum now where we get advisors in to the Schroders office here, and we talk to them about where we're doing well and where we're doing less well and where we can give them further support. So hopefully this thing all fits together, but I know there's always more to be done, and but I'm hoping that we're making a good starting point with this, but we're happy to have any conversations on consumer duty. So hopefully that's been helpful in terms of really thinking about why advisors might outsource, how do they select a provider, what are some of the factors, but what the future might look like, and also how this sits alongside consumer duty. And just before I hand over to Jenna for Q&A, just as a highlight here, we have alluded a number of times to our solutions business here at Schroders, where we run 3 sets of model portfolios and 2 ranges of multi-asset funds, and then a couple of what we call specialist funds. And I've highlighted that there will be some changes in the next few weeks. Watch out for those. But clearly one of the things we do all the time is look at where we can develop further solutions to just ensure that we're helping you deliver good quality client outcomes. I would also just like to highlight our blended portfolios. Alex, I don't know if you want to say anything about those, but they have now got, I think we've just passed our 3-year track record, so we're really proud of a very positive 3-year track record.
Yeah, I think, how do you combine active and passive in a multi-asset solution, thinking about how to allocate the passive rather than just trying to reduce cost? And I think that's really what we've achieved in a sort of first, second quartile across the range.
So do get in touch with us if you want to hear any more information, or just contact your local Schroders representative. But there's a number of ways that you can get in touch with us. So Jenna, I'm now going to hand over to you once I've passed the risk warnings and important information, and I'm going to stop sharing whilst we move to Q&A.
Great, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. Now we've got about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question to any of our panelists, please write it in the chat box and I'll ask it as soon as I'm able. I can see a few questions in there already. I have a couple of my own, so I'll start with one of mine. So consumer duty, massive regulatory change and challenge. Do you think consumer duty will drive continued growth in outsourcing?
Yeah, so I think from an investment aspect, definitely, because one of the trends that we're seeing is, historically there were even advisory portfolios managed, and in the eyes of the regulator, that is still a product, right? I hate the word product for what we do, but that's what it will be classified. And so you could argue that these advisory portfolios require consumer testing, understanding, a fair value assessment, and more advisors that we work with are saying, well, can we work with someone to deliver that? The value that we bring to the party is around the holistic plan, the tax management, the behavioral bias management, which have been so crucial in the last couple of years. And I think that will definitely keep driving a trend. And we're always sort of happy to discuss and help where we can.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Also, following on from consumer duty, do you think outsourcing due diligence will become even more important because of the duty? And following on from that, what are your key considerations when advisors are choosing a provider?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I do think due diligence will become increasingly important, particularly when you look at this whole outcome of products and services. It's interesting, we spent a bit of time a couple of years ago speaking to advisors about the PROD regulation and about segmentation and looking at different client segments, and then ensuring that we were delivering different products and services to those clients. In fact, we still have a guide that I'm sure is not particularly out of date, but if anybody wants that, we're happy to share. But I do think that consumer duty in some respects takes us a step further. Actually, one of the slides I didn't put in here in the research was that advisors were reducing, or the number of advisors that were segmenting their client base had reduced. And I thought that was quite interesting within the context of consumer duty, where it feels to me that some element of segmentation has to be part of consumer duty in order to make sure that you deliver the right products and services to different groups of clients. We're happy to have conversations on that area as well, but certainly what we're seeing is that advisors are asking us increasingly for help with their due diligence. And that's something that we've always got to be on the front foot with, always got to make sure that our data is up to date, particularly on third-party systems. But yeah, I would absolutely would agree that consumer duty is kind of maybe raising the stakes a little bit in terms of due diligence. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think being able to evidence that you have tested all parts, not just the investment component, but some of the operational components as well. in the next decade will be absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I think that operational point is really interesting. We obviously run our solutions on, I think it's 14 platforms now, Alex, and you have a team of, well, you can explain better than I can, but the amount of time that it takes to set up all of these rebalances once a quarter, it's a lot of manpower, isn't it? And it's a lot of checking and cross-checking and dotting I's and making sure it's all ready to go. And it's really important.
We got a team headed up by an operations specialist, 4 individuals, that their full-time focus is just making sure the portfolios are traded at the same point across all the platforms in the right share classes. That data is fed back into Morningstar and FE to generate fact sheets, to have that automated in advisors' inboxes within sort of 10 business days post month end. That is their full-time responsibility. And I think without that sort of investment, this business isn't scalable.
Mm-hmm. Go to a question from an advisor now. He says, I tend to use DFMs only for larger portfolios, and then goes on to say maybe we should ask about the average portfolio that's being outsourced. What's your sort of take on that?
Averages are dangerous.
Yeah.
So we have accounts that range from 10,000 to 5,000 to 10 million.
Mm-hmm.
So if you run the average, you'll probably get somewhere to 200 to 300, but it's not really representative of the investors.
It's also a really interesting question, because the data that we get back from the platforms that we run the models on varies massively in terms of how we can analyze that. And of course, because we operate the agent as client from a regulatory standpoint, we don't actually have, we don't get to see the underlying client data.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually difficult to assess.
Yeah, these are from client conversations, advisor conversations.
So we know obviously, roughly what's coming in and who's supporting us. But if you actually look at the data from the platforms, it's very difficult because we don't get the underlying data. So we don't always know how many portfolios are being attached to our models, if I could describe it like that. So it's a really interesting but challenging question. I'd love to get better quality data.
Another question here says, if I'm an advisor and I outsource some of my proposition, is it for me to ensure that the provider is consumer duty compliant?
So I think there's 2 components there. There's one for the provider to make sure that they're offering value. They've ensured that their marketing material is understood by the consumer. They have disclosed what their target market is and made sure that solution is available. Then as an advisor, you've got a second bit to say, what does my end-to-end process look like? Am I offering fair value? Have I made sure that clients are on the right models for the right outcomes? And that's where the interface comes back, is to say, the model provider says X, I need X, does X equal X? And I think that is the important bit that advisors are responsible for.
Yeah, I would agree. We have an interesting phrase that we've been using throughout our consumer duty project. It's about like a relay race. So at what point do you hand the baton over? So where does the lines of responsibility between us as a manufacturer and the advisor, where does that get handed over? Where the lines blurred in some respect? But I do think that whilst we will send out information to advisors that are on our distribution list, I think it is the responsibility of the advisor to make sure that their provider gives them the right information in terms of consumer duty. So, make sure you've got the fair value documentation, target market, because that actually, to Alex's point, almost needs integrated into the overall fair value assessment that you will produce in terms of your overall advice and investment proposition.
Yeah, and the duty talks about making sure that it's understanding the client experience across the offering through the whole life cycle, right, rather than at individual points.
And you mentioned your next advisor survey is coming up. When can advisors expect to see that?
Okay, so we're going to run the actual data. So the questionnaires will go out at the end of April, beginning of May, and we then get it back, analyze it, produce our report, so it should be available in early June.
lots on consumer duty in there, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one because we actually run our main annual survey every November, and we do it in November because we always like to ask about the past year and what advisors think about next year and what are their challenges and what are their views on markets and everything. This interim one started actually only 2 years ago when we decided, it might have been 3 years ago, I've lost the track of years as a result of COVID, but we ran what we called a pulse survey to ask advisors what was happening, how were they managing clients whilst we were in lockdown, what were some of the challenges with volatility. And we decided to just keep running this pulse survey every half year. So we have some questions, particularly the more investment related ones that we run every 6 months now. But the pulse one for me is great fun because I can sit back and say, what do I think is happening in the market right now? What are advisors' problems and challenges? And how do we ask the right questions to make sure we've got a good understanding? So you're right, Jenna, there'll be a couple of questions in relation to consumer duty. There'll be a couple of questions in relation to sustainability. But we'll also be running some questions on the impact of the cost of living crisis and the reshaping of portfolios that might be having to be undertaken as a result to help clients either manage their own income capabilities or people that want to help their family, their kids, for example. So we're just going to look at that kind of broader pieces to what's happening right now. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Just finally, any sort of key takeaways you'd like the listeners to hear from you today?
Oh, great one at the end. I guess from me, that it's really challenging, isn't it, at the moment, in terms of we've got volatility, we've got regulation, we've got end of the tax year, let's not forget about that. So it's about making sure that you work with, I guess, providers of any services that you use as an advisor to make sure that they're really giving you the right help and support that you need when times are challenging as they are at the moment.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think volatility creates opportunity. Timing the market is nearly impossible, and we need to be solutions and outcomes focused, especially during times like this.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We're coming up towards the end of our session now, so let me thank you, Gillian and Alex. That was a fascinating presentation, and thank you for your insights during the Q&A. If your question was not answered in the time available, don't worry, we'll send it to the good folks at Schroders and they will respond to you personally. Now, before we wrap up, let's just take a quick look at those learning objectives again. Advisors should now be able to identify the increase in outsourcing trends and why it is important to advisor firms, understand the criteria advisors use when selecting a solutions provider, and understand the relationship between using a solutions provider and consumer duty. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for your questions, and thank you again to Gillian and Alex for joining me today and for letting me and you folks at home grill them with our questions. On that note, if your question didn't get answered, Gillian and the Schroders team will do their best to do so after the event. Before we close up, I should assure you that your CPD will be delivered tomorrow. Before we sign off, just let me remind you of some dates for your diary during April. On the 12th, we're partnering with Performance Leads to bring you a fascinating digital working lunch where we'll discuss the benefits of using lead generation tools to grow your client base. Our editor, Hope, will be in discussion with co-founders Ed Wilkinson and Pete Yates. If your business is anywhere near York, Norwich or Exeter, you're very welcome to attend one of our regional working lunches in association with Benchmark and Goldman Sachs Asset Management. On the 18th, which is my birthday, we'll be in York. On the 19th, we'll be at Dunstan Hall near Norwich, and we'll complete our tour on the 20th of April at Exeter Golf and Country Club. Not only will you hear from two superb speakers on building value in your business and adapting to the investment landscape in a rapidly changing world, but we will offer you a great lunch and the opportunity to network with your peers. On the 25th, we'll be celebrating the very best in our industry when we host the annual Professional Advisor Awards at London's Hilton Bankside Hotel. If you'd care to come along and rub shoulders with all our winners, there are still 1 or 2 tables remaining. And finally, on the 26th, we're running our flagship conference, PA360 at the Brewery in London. This year's programme covers everything from consumer duty to tax, from regulation to tech, and our 40 plus speakers will cover every subject that affects running an advisor business. PA360 is now the largest annual management conference for financial advisors in the UK, and we would love to see you there. All in all, that's a total of 13 hours CPD for you, and you can find details of and register for all these events on the Professional Advisor website under the Events tab. So that's it for today's session. All that remains is for me to thank our speakers, Gillian and Alex from Schroders, for a really insightful and interesting session. But of course, our biggest thanks go to you, our readers, for your company this lunchtime. I trust you found this helpful and worthwhile. If you did, then we look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.